The iPhone 14 Pro Max and the S22 Ultra are two of my absolute favorite phones of the year. We've got the best camera systems that Apple and Samsung offer, very powerful chips, premium designs, and great build quality. So which one is actually better? Let's start out by looking at the displays where both phones really shine. You see what I did there? But seriously, this is an area where you're actually picking between two great choices. Both offer beautiful displays with HDR support, 120Hz adaptive refresh rate, meaning that they can automatically adjust to give you a faster refresh rate for smoother animations and scrolling, but at the same time, they can also lower the refresh rate and then save on battery life when you're looking at static content. The S22 Ultra display is larger, it has a higher screen to body ratio, a higher resolution, and a higher pixel density. The iPhone technically has a brighter display with 2000 nits peak brightness versus 1750 on the S22 Ultra. And remember, the nits are not linear, so while it is technically brighter, both displays work really great when you're outside in direct sunlight or when you're in situations where you have to deal with reflections. The one minor comment about the S22 Ultra display is that the curved edges create what looks like a drop shadow at the top and the bottom, or on the sides, depending on how you're holding it. Now, personally, it doesn't really bother me, and it's not something that I notice unless I intentionally look for it, but if you're super picky, you can see it. Now, both phones have an always-on display, but we're seeing very different implementations. The S22 Ultra has a more minimalistic approach, showing the clock, icons for notifications, the fingerprint sensor, battery charge, and then music information if a song is playing. You can also customize when you want to see it and a few other settings. The iPhone 14 Pro Max shows you a dimmed down version of your lock screen with your wallpaper. You can add widgets, you can see if media is playing, but there's no control over when it's active. You can either enable or disable it. Ultimately, you can't really go wrong with either display. Both are great, but if you made me choose, I would pick the S22 Ultra. I have a lot of phones, I switch between them all the time, and there's something about this display that just makes everything really pop. Now, from a design standpoint, the iPhone 14 Pro Max looks pretty much like the previous version, with rounded corners, squared off edges. We're getting a stainless steel frame versus aluminum on the S22 Ultra, and instead of the notch, we now have this dynamic island, and more on this in just a minute. The S22 Ultra has a similar design to the Note 20 Ultra with curved sides, a pinhole front-facing camera, and a frame that flattens out at the top and the bottom. Both phones look and feel very premium, but personally, I like the look of the S22 Ultra better, and it might still be the nicest looking phone that I've ever used. And I know that the look of the phone shouldn't really be the ultimate deciding factor, but it is a device that we use and look at all day, so I still think it's a consideration. What's really impressive here is that with this super clean design, Samsung was able to integrate an S Pen into a dedicated silo on the bottom left corner. So if you need to sign a document or take some handwritten notes, you're good to go. For ports, we're getting a USB-C port on the S22 Ultra and a Lightning port on the iPhone. There's not much to say here other than obviously USB-C is better. Now back to the front-facing camera modules. The new dynamic island on the iPhone 14 Pro Max is a clever way to combine software with two smaller hardware elements and then create a useful, animated, and interactive user experience. So in addition to hiding the camera, this area also allows us to fluidly interact with a background app, alerts, and notifications without having to leave the app that we're currently using. Now, in terms of the impact on the aesthetics of the display, the hole punch camera on the S22 Ultra is much less disruptive or noticeable, and in theory, Samsung could create their own implementation of Dynamic Island while still maintaining the same camera footprint. But what the iPhone's camera module gives us is a true depth camera that's responsible for Face ID, which is used for biometric authentication. The S22 Ultra uses an under-display ultrasonic sensor, and it might be the best one that I've seen on any of the phones that I've tested. Having said that, I definitely prefer Face ID. It's essentially automatic when I pick up my phone, and it works pretty much every time, whereas the S22 Ultra sensor, while big and conveniently located, can still be a little bit finicky at times. Which brings me to ergonomics. Now, both phones are definitely on the larger size, And while the S22 Ultra is a bit bigger, it's actually more comfortable for me to hold because of the curved edges. With the iPhone 14 Pro Max, the edges actually feel kind of sharp and they dig into my hand a little bit when I try to hold and navigate the phone with just one hand. And just like with the iPhone 13 Pro Max, the back of the 14 Pro Max is a little less slippery than the S22 Ultra, which brings me to durability. Now, both phones have an IP68 rating, so they're protected against dust and water. But the iPhone can be submerged in up to 6 meters of water for 30 minutes versus 1.5 meters on the S22 Ultra. Now, personally, I hope not to do that to either one of these phones, but I'm still going to give the edge to the iPhone. In terms of glass, we're getting Gorilla Glass Victus Plus on the front and the back of the S22 Ultra, and then Apple's Ceramic Shield on the iPhone. Now, is Ceramic Shield actually stronger in a way that's meaningful for real life use? Maybe. And I know some of you make fun of me for this, but I drop my phone all the time, so I always use a case. Now this year, Casetify sent over a few of their cases and a couple of accessories that take protection to the level that I need. And you have to ask yourself, what makes for a good case? For me, number one is protection, but also at the same time, I don't want a case that's super bulky. Right now, I've been using the Impact and the Ultra Impact. The Impact gives you up to 8.2 feet drop protection, and the Ultra Impact can go up to 11.5 feet. Now, I don't know what you guys are doing throwing your phone from that high up, but you could. And in both cases, we're getting raised bezels and a camera ring, but the Ultra Impact has additional protection in the corners. Now, this year, Casetify incorporated a twister design into their EcoShock tech, and that gives you a 20% increase in protection while reducing the weight and the size of the case. The iPhone 14 cases are made from 65% recycled and plant-based material, and they're also partially made from upcycled phone cases as part of the Recasetify program. Now just think of all the cases that you've ever had. They're out there somewhere unless you recycle them. They have a ton of designs, from super basic to some incredibly creative and colorful options. You can also select MagSafe compatible cases. So if you want peace of mind knowing that your phone is safe, go to casetify.com/techgeartalk. You'll automatically get 15% off your purchase, and thank you to Casetify for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now this year, Apple introduced the new A16 Bionic chip with 6 gigabytes of RAM. The S22 Ultra uses the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chip with either 8 or 12 gigabytes depending on how much storage you get. So let's take a quick look at benchmarks and then more importantly, real life use. The iPhone 14 Pro Max comes out well ahead with about 50% better single core performance and 23% better multi-core performance. And this is with the game optimizing service on the S22 Ultra, which was found to throttle the performance of many apps and games, but not the benchmarking apps. Of course, since the update, you can now disable this optimization service on the S22 Ultra, but the more important question to me is, how do these phones perform in real life? I haven't noticed any type of slowdown with either phone for like the basic things that I do every day. So things like browsing the web, watching videos, going through different social media apps, or any of the typical productivity tasks that I do. I have a dedicated section for gaming later on in the video, but for now, I still put the iPhone 14 Pro Max ahead, not so much because I'm noticing a difference at this time, but with the faster and more capable processor, it means that as time goes on, this phone should continue to perform better for longer. Now, while the iPhone 14 Pro Max has a more powerful chip, the S22 Ultra is actually better for multitasking. You're able to run 2 apps at the same time, either side by side or one on top of the other. And you can also boot up in DeX mode. You can connect a monitor, a keyboard, and a mouse. And then you can let the S22 Ultra deliver a user experience that's similar to using a desktop or a laptop. Now, of course, not every user is going to take advantage of this feature, but there's no question that the S22 Ultra is a more versatile option. When we look at Android/One UI versus iOS, we're getting 2 great options, but with vastly different approaches. And then, of course, your ecosystem is going to play a major role. When you're using the S22 Ultra, you're getting a very customizable operating system, so you have more control over the different aspects of the user experience. You can get it to look and work exactly how you want, and there's a side menu which gives you quick access to apps and layouts. iOS is a much simpler operating system where every feature is elegantly integrated. There's some overlap with iPadOS, and the apps are extremely well optimized. It's also very simple to use because there's less potential for customization, so the user experience is more consistent. Apple also tends to take their time with certain features. So for example, the always-on display that I mentioned earlier is brand new for Apple this year, but it's been available on Samsung phones for years. Apple offers better long-term support, and while Samsung did make improvements this year in this area, the iPhone will receive updates for longer. The updates are also released at the same time for all iPhone users, and they seem to be released faster than Samsung's. Naturally, the ecosystem plays a big part in this decision. The iPhone is going to be a better fit if you're using other Apple products, and the S22 Ultra is more tightly integrated with other Samsung devices and with Windows desktops and laptops. When it comes to battery life, we're getting a 5,000 mAh on the S22 Ultra versus 4,500 on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. I can get through a full day of typical use with both devices unless I'm playing games for a couple of hours. The S22 Ultra gives me about 8 hours of screen on time, and the iPhone 14 Pro Max is now the second longest lasting phone that I've had with about 9.5 hours. Now, the only phone that has outlasted it is the iPhone 13 Pro Max with about 10 hours, and I wonder if this has to do with the new always-on display. When we look at charging, the S22 Ultra comes out ahead with 45-watt charging versus 27 on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So it takes a little bit over an hour to get a full charge on the S22 Ultra, and then about an hour and 45 minutes on the iPhone. Both phones can be wirelessly charged at 15 watts, but the S22 Ultra also has a feature called reverse charging, which lets you wirelessly charge another device using the phone itself. So when it comes to battery and charging, it's a choice between longer battery life on the iPhone or faster charging and reverse charging on the S22 Ultra. Now let's talk about the camera system. And even though I'm a camera nerd, I'm going to keep it basic, and we're going to take a look at some sample photos and videos. So the S22 Ultra still has the best camera system that Samsung offers, with a 108 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra wide, and two 10 megapixel telephoto cameras, one with a 3x optical zoom and one with a 10x optical zoom. We also have an excellent 40 megapixel selfie camera. The iPhone 14 Pro Max got the biggest update that we've seen in an iPhone camera in quite a while. And we now have a 48 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra wide, and a 12 megapixel telephoto with a 3x optical zoom. There's also a LiDAR scanner, which helps with night mode portraits and with autofocus in low light situations, both of which I think are really important. Now finally, the front-facing camera on the iPhone is a 12 megapixel true depth camera. But of course, hardware is only part of the story. And these days, computational photography has so much to do with the final image. So the iPhone photos were a little more contrasty and a bit more saturated, which is kind of the reverse of how it used to be. I also like the quality of the ultra-wide camera on the iPhone better. On the other hand, the S22 Ultra photos had better dynamic range, meaning that there was more detail in the shadows and the highlights. I did find that the iPhone photos were more consistent across the board, whereas the S22 Ultra would have more variation in terms of exposure. When it comes to zoom, both phones have a 3x zoom. So here's a sample from both. The iPhone photo has more contrast and the S22 Ultra has much less noise. When we go to 10x, it's not even close. The S22 Ultra is only using optical zoom and the iPhone is using digital zoom. And even though with the S22 Ultra, it's only a 10 megapixel image and 12 on the iPhone, the S22 Ultra has a much sharper image, there's less noise, and the colors look great. And this is just a quick example of why megapixels are not the only thing that you should be looking at when you compare cameras and sensors. Now, when we move to 15x, again, there's no question that the S22 Ultra wins. It's only having the digitally zoom from 10x instead of 3x, and the image quality is far superior. Of course, the S22 Ultra can zoom all the way up to 100x, but that's not really something that I would ever use. Now, moving on to video, I still think that the iPhone is the best phone that I've used so far. The video quality is better than Samsung's, but the S22 Ultra might have the best video in a non-iPhone phone. There are also additional features like ProRes on the iPhone and 8K on the S22 Ultra, neither of which I personally use because the files are so big. But if you do plan on using them, they're actually super well executed on their respective phones. Like I said, I'm a huge camera nerd, so if you're interested in a dedicated camera review, please let me know in the comments section. And as a final word, the S22 Ultra camera app is much more comprehensive and has some amazing features like director view, which lets you preview what every camera sees at the same time while you're recording, and then you can switch between them in real time. Now, before we get to the conclusion, let's talk about gaming. Now, in terms of performance, both phones were able to run all the games that I usually play. So that's PUBG, Genshin, Asphalt, and then of course, less demanding games ran without a problem. The games were responsive and lag-free. The graphics looked great on these two amazing displays. And without external cooling with something like the Razer Phone Cooler Chroma, both phones got hot during long gaming sessions. When playing PUBG, both phones could go up to HDR for graphics with extreme for frame rate, or Ultra HD for graphics with Ultra for frame rate. Now, I usually play on balanced and then extreme in order to get a good combination of gameplay experience and battery performance. I was also able to stream games on both phones by pairing an Xbox controller and then using the Xbox Game Pass app, and both phones could run any of the available games. Now, long term for gaming, I'm going to give the edge to the iPhone. There wasn't a noticeable difference in performance now, but there's so much additional headroom in terms of performance when you compare the A16 to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 that the iPhone is just going to perform better for longer. So that brings me to which of these phones would I pick as the better phone? And remember that I have links in the descriptions to all the products that I talked about. The iPhone 14 Pro Max has a much more powerful processor, longer operating system support with an incredibly well-optimized app ecosystem. It has better video capabilities, excellent photo quality, slightly better speakers, and better battery life. The S22 Ultra has better ergonomics, a more updated and elegant design. It includes an S Pen. It has a larger and higher resolution display, a more versatile camera system with much better zoom, a more customizable operating system, better multitasking capabilities, and faster and more versatile charging options. If you're already deep in the Apple ecosystem or you're just familiar with iOS and you feel more comfortable, it's pretty hard to move away from the iPhone. But if you're not an Apple user or you want to try a new operating system, the S22 Ultra is an outstanding Android phone that you should definitely check out. Now you should watch how the S22 Ultra compares with the Z Fold 4. You know what I always say? Buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.